Welcome to CivilNet. My guest is Hans Gutbrod, who is a regional analyst, but he's more than that. Hans has, for the last 10, 12, 13 years, lived in the region, worked in the region as head of the CRRC, the Caucasus Resource and Research Center. I'm sure I've said that backwards. And in that capacity has been extremely, not just helpful, but also useful in trying to direct discussion about democratic political development, social development in the post-Soviet space here in the Caucasus in a way that is substantive, that is from the ground up, that tries to understand people's attitudes, opinions, understand where the attitudes and opinions need to be worked on and where people need to be educated in order to move on and take some of the risks that democracy demands. Hans, I don't know if that's a fair sort of assessment about why you did what you did.
Right.
But I also need to say that we at Civilitas have worked with CRRC, with you specifically, in trying to develop our polling operation.
Right.
To try to do it in a way that follows your example. That is, that we try to ask the questions that matter and questions whose answers ought to be useful to policymakers. And in that sense, I want to say both thank you and also say good luck in your next endeavor. I know this is the end of this tour. Let's talk a little bit, especially given your perspective and you know, your incredibility to blend the big picture with the situation on the ground. It's been 20-something years, and there have got to be lessons learned. Lessons learned both for insiders, for us living here, and for the well-meaning, benevolent outsiders who want to nudge this process along. Let's talk about some of those lessons learned, and especially keeping in mind that, you know, in many ways here in Armenia, we look at Georgia both as competitor, as example, a little enviously, sometimes a little dismissively. In that context, what do you think are the lessons that we insiders, let's start with us, should have learned about how we try to take this process, this difficult process, forward?
Right. Well, that's an excellent question, and many ideas come to mind. But the one thing that does stand out for me is that it's both necessary and it's possible to eliminate corruption and street-level corruption. And it's incredibly important because in that way it gives citizens a way of really developing their own lives in which the state is not something that interferes with their lives and is constantly disrupts it, and where people can make longer term plans and can somehow have an environment in which they can engage. So I do think that stands out as a lesson
from Georgia.
From Georgia, and it's one of the issues that when we look both at the situation in Armenia but also at the situation in Azerbaijan, that stands out as a key problem that remains to be addressed, and that I think defines a lot of the unhappiness.
And you said in passing, street-level corruption.
Yeah, I mean, street-level corruption is really an essential step and a necessary step. And then, you know, beyond that, you move into questions about that are complex, where elites are intermeshed, and these are not things that are specific to this area. These are challenges that other countries face as well, and that require different types of institutional arrangements that countries sort of need to work out within themselves, and they need to develop the institutions to deal with that. But I think it's important to really focus at street-level corruption and already say that's a huge step, rather than to say it somewhat dismissively, oh, only street-level corruption, therefore the effort is incomplete. And what I think is important is really to keep a positive perspective about what can be done, rather than a dismissive perspective about what hasn't been achieved yet.
And as lessons learned go, is the lesson learned not just that, yes, it can be done away with, but also that political will really does add up to something other than a line in a political statement? I mean, can we really take this back to just political will?
Yeah, political will is absolutely essential to that.
Sufficient?
It is not sufficient because you have to do some of the alignments properly. And I mean, I think that it is political will, putting the right people in the right places, meaning a interior minister actually makes it happen, and a finance minister who assures that there's a tax collection so that ultimately the state functions are paid for and people don't need to somehow find alternative modes of getting the salary. And then institutional arrangements where you simplify a lot of the procedures, you give up some of the things that ideally a state would do, but conversely you gain huge amounts of possibilities about where the citizens can, what the citizens can do. And I think that that is a worthwhile exchange, but it needs to be, it really needs to be pursued locally, and outside advice can only give some hints for how to do that.
What are the hints, or what is the experience at the tax collection level? You know, we often talk in Armenia about our not such great standing in terms of tax collection rate versus GDP. Ours is something like 17%. We really ought to be at 24, 25, I think. How has Georgia tried to address that in a way that is comfortable on my skin at the street level? The tax collection process being fairer and more transparent.
Well, I mean, I think rigor is the key, and to be rigorous, you have to simplify. And so having a simple tax regime and then ensuring that it's applied consistently. But again, you then need to work the Ministry of Interior so that you have the enforcement side in place, and that street level vendors have a cash register, and that you don't create uneven environments. That's important. But you have to be willing to fight the big battles as well with entrenched interests.
And have they been? Is that working?
Yeah, that absolutely is working. I mean, the question is to what extent some of those things have created their own backlashes because one hasn't engaged there with the citizens, and things are seen as imposition rather than an institutional arrangement that will ultimately make certain things possible. So I think it's possible. It's actually in everyone's long-term interest. Everybody does win, and I think that this is really one of the key things that Georgia can illustrate. You can do these reforms. You can actually have a relatively long run as a reformer in government, and that's a very, very important lesson, because previously the lesson widely believed to be the main lesson is that reform means self-sacrifice, because you go up against so many entrenched interests that are across society.
So reform does not have to come at my expense necessarily.
Right.
What other good lessons learned, before I ask about the bad lessons learned?
Really being courageous in mobilizing those people in society that want to be part of a reform agenda and giving them a chance to get engaged. So often giving young people extraordinary opportunities and responsibility, and accepting that some mistakes will be made. And I think one of the interesting lessons over time, I myself often saw reforms that went awry, and this was irritating and annoying. But it was interesting that over time they sometimes, through a process of back and forth, ultimately then at a critical point got it right. So I think being courageous with the things, but also being disciplined about being honest when admitting that things didn't work, that was a key part, and that made a lot of things possible in the country.
So when we hear sometimes, or the international community laughs that, if you're over 30, you can't be a minister in Georgia, that risk-taking also has, in many ways, paid off if you stick with it, and they have stuck with it.
That risk-taking has paid off. At the same time, what people from the outside that came in for shorter stints, what they didn't see is that Georgia had a much more fundamental collapse than many of its neighbors, with a civil war, with a really wholesale destruction of institutions, so that institutions that in other countries had a degree of continuity from Soviet time, that didn't actually happen. So you had to rebuild in a radically different way.
And the not-so-great lessons learned.
Plenty of those. And I think, everywhere where you try to do lots of things, a lot of things go wrong. And I think in a number of key lessons was that it remained very hard to tackle unemployment, that education policy was a back and forth in terms of really attempting to decentralize, but then maybe not resourcing that effort properly, so that later you ended up re-centralizing. And with a view that there wasn't overwhelming change in the type of overwhelming improvement that people had expected in that field. And maybe the biggest one, that agriculture remained key to Georgia's future, and this was an area that received comparatively little attention. And in retrospect, if it had been given huge amounts of attention very early on in the process, I think the country would be much more along, both economically but also politically and democratically, because you'd help people make a living out that right now are in pretty desperate circumstances still in the countryside.
We're at a point here in Armenia where, although the calls for revolution have diminished, there is still at many levels this core belief that unless there's revolution, things won't be fundamentally different. And you watch Georgia and you realize that, yeah, revolution did lead to a lot of fundamental reforms. But now that we're coming kind of to the end of these revolutionaries period,
right,
that perhaps it's not going to be as smooth a transition as democratic a transition. Is that too extreme a statement? How is that transition appearing to take place, and is it going to require more revolutions for these reforms to take hold? Saakashvili's on his way out, or maybe he's not. Are the state institutions going to be adapted to fit what he thinks he wants to do? Do people think that's okay because after all he's the revolutionary?
I think what helps to move forward in a process like that is ideally framing the debates about what are the particular type of arrangements we want to have. And the type of discourse that's not helpful for moving forward is one that's focused on legitimacy, where you essentially just talk, in the Georgian context, where you just talk about how illegitimate either the government is or the opposition's claims are, because those are debates that cannot be resolved.
Yeah, sounds very familiar.
Are the sort of Greek tragedy type of setups. I think what's very helpful to have as debates are, what are some of the key things we need to get right? And then to push for those relentlessly and for people to engage on that, and then to draw the consequences if there's really remains obstruction to very concrete policy proposals that are, so to speak, policy fixes in certain areas, to draw their consequences in what needs to be done to make the lives of citizens better. Yeah, so that may sound a bit abstract, but what I think is important is to combine both a key principle. It needs to be, the governments need to do more to respond to what the citizens need, and then very practical solutions to that, and not start more or less with a legitimacy debate in terms of, we need this change because these people are all bad in these particular ways. You've just
put words to what you've done for a decade of your life. That is, try to talk policy instead of politics. And and I've been saying this so much lately, Armenian as in Russian, it turns out, policy and politics are the same word, unfortunately. How is it in Georgian, and how is it in the discourse in Georgian? Is it in fact possible in a post-Soviet space where politics was totally individual-based, that can you in fact move from that idea of politics to policy politics? And how do you do that? How do we do that in Armenia? Because we're still fighting the legitimacy debate. Who's good and who's bad, and the bad should go, and we don't know who the good is, who should come in, and it's all individual based still, not a policy debate.
Different actors and different groups have different ways in which they can contribute to that. And I think what institutions outside immediate politics can do is that they help frame a discussion and bring people together by articulating problems, for example, very, very clearly. So that's what we were trying to do with our research, and highlight that, taking the Armenian example, that if an overwhelming amount of people say that corruption is at exactly the same level as they've experienced it before, then we know that this problem is still unchanged. And so this is something that, for example, researchers can contribute. I think infusing facts and good thinking into the debate is one way in which you can crowd out the polarization. There is the saying by Senator Moynihan that everyone's entitled to his own opinion, but not to his own facts. And so just highlighting what the facts are and beginning to...
He never lived in the Caucasus.
Well, I mean, he never lived in the Caucasus, but at the same time, there's such a lack of these facts and lack of these debates that contributing to that, I think in itself actually helps bring people together. And we experienced that again and again, that it actually helped structure better discussions if at the beginning one looked at the glass being half full or half empty, but at least people knew where the glass was, so to speak, and then they could start their debate about how they interpret that.
I would like to think that one of the ways that we could all be moving forward faster would be if there were more of a feeling of region in this region rather than three isolated entities each fighting their own fight in the best way that they can. Do you have a sense that maybe we are moving in that direction? Are things any more regional feeling than they were a decade ago? My answer would be no, but I'm wondering if your answer would be different.
No, I'm afraid that things have moved in a very different direction. And I mean, the situation in Azerbaijan is a very difficult one in which the country has had huge opportunities, economic opportunities, and has squandered them and has essentially it's a very, very corrupt, and in that way also, unfortunately, a dangerous government, and not one that one can in any way engage with, because it's a very small, secluded group. And Georgia has its own strident course towards the west, and Armenia is in its own situation. So I think, unfortunately, the situation is less regional than it could be, but I still think that individuals working with each other and understanding what exactly works and what doesn't work, that's useful. And I think there are a lot of lessons in Georgia, for example, for Armenia in terms of how you could create a much better environment for people, and also that the aspiration is possible. When we talk to Georgians, when we do research with Georgians, 9% of Georgians tell us that they want to leave the country and never come back. It's always been historically low in Georgia, but in Armenia the number is close to 30%. And if you talk to young males, it's close to 50% of young males that want to go and never return to Armenia. That's a situation that's not sustainable for the country, and it's something that needs to be addressed. So by comparison, learning what to ask for and what to demand, and that some change has been possible just a few kilometers to the north, and therefore it should be possible here as well. I think that's a good way.
Well, that's as hopeful a realistic way of ending as I can think. Thank you, Hans Gutbrod. Thank you for all of not just the work that you've done, but in many ways the examples that you've set and the standards that you've made available for all of us to follow, so that we can in fact get those facts straight, so that we can fix the opinions to go in the way in which we think we want and deserve. Thank you. Good luck in all of your future endeavors, and we hope the connections with Armenia and the Caucasus remain.
Indeed. Thanks very much for having me over.
Our guest has been Hans Gutbrod, for a decade and more, heading the Caucasus Research and Resource Centers in the Caucasus. Stay with CivilNet.